It's time for us to check back in with the family history and stories of Opal Corn Myers. If you missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Corn Ancestors. The other story that I liked so well, the one about John Peter, is interesting and funny too. It's a story about the earliest known corn ancestors, Matthew and Molly Corn, who came to America with their son, John Peter, who was only a few years old. When John Peter became a young man, he fought under Washington at Valley Forge in 1777 and 1778. It is there that our first family tale begins. John Peter was a good-looking young'un and just as full of spunk and mischief as could be. One day he was attempting to steal apples for his troops when a young woman with a gun stopped him. "Good afternoon, soldier," she said sweetly. "You wouldn't be stealing our apples now, would you?" Slowly he turned around, his arms full of apples, and found himself looking down the barrel of a gun at the prettiest young woman he had seen in some time. Her beautiful big blue eyes, framed by a head full of fiery red hair, stared back at him. Her tone changed. "If you want to live to see your next battle, soldier, you had best put those apples down nice and gently and walk away like you've never been here." Well, it looked like she was full of feisty words too, so he figured he had better do some mighty fast talking. He kept begging her and talking to her about his starving men. Well, sure enough, she gave him those apples. He had only come to steal apples, but while he was there, he stole her heart and lost his heart too. John Peter had for sure fallen in love. He told her, "When this war is over, I'm going to come back here and get you." He kept his word. After a short courtship, Hannah Elizabeth Parr's father gave his consent, and they were married in May of 1778. They had a son named Arthur, and my papa was named after him. There's a footnote down here I'll read to you. It says, John Peter was born March 3rd, 1752, and died on October 14th, 1843. Then the next part of this is John Corn, the oldest grandson of John Peter, married Mary Wade Carter, the daughter of Jesse and Lavina Sams Carter on, we'll have to go to the next page, but the footnote about John is, John Corn, born October 18, 1813, was chosen for war, but in May of 1862, he resigned from the Army and his 18-year-old son, John Heatherly Corn, went in his place. John Sr. owned 1,500 acres of land when he died, January 2nd, 1875. His wife Mary died January 14th, 1879. They were buried on top of a hill on the right side of the highway leading from Clayton to, this is a, I don't know if this is a typo or not, but it kind of says Haravasi, and I think that should be Hiwassee. I looked and, searched and see if I could find, maybe that was a town that I just wasn't familiar with in that area that I am familiar with, but I think it's supposed to be Hiwassee. I might be wrong about that though. About 1.5 miles west of Upper Hightower Baptist Church, leading from Clayton, John Heatherly married Sarah Elizabeth Dillard, daughter of John Barnett and Rachel Matilda McKinney Dillard. John H. was the only postmaster the little town of Visage, I don't know how you say that, Georgia ever had. John and Sarah had a son, Sylvester Barnard, born August 7, 1868, who became a doctor. John Heatherly died July 4th, 1927, and was buried along with his wife and her parents in the cemetery overlooking the old homestead. So now to pick back up with what we had just read, John Corn, the oldest grandson of John Peter, married Mary Wade Carter, the daughter of Jesse and Lavina Sams Carter, on November 10th, 1836. The Carters were one of the first settlers of Rabun County, Georgia, after it was organized in 1819. John Corn and Elijah Kimsey were elected as delegates from Towns County, Georgia, to the convention in Milledgeville. This convention was to decide whether or not Georgia should secede from the Union. Corn and Kimsey rode 400 miles to vote against secession, but Georgia voted to secede, 160 for, 130 against. Grandma and Aunt Jane. When Grandma Corn fell back sometime in 1915 and broke her hip, the mission people came to see her often. They were always helping out in some way, and over the years she grew close to several of the chapel women. After her fall, she wasn't able to get out much at all, and for the rest of her life she had a great deal of trouble walking. Grandma made the best of it, but she did not like being restricted one little bit. Being as heavy as she was didn't help the situation either. She had always enjoyed going to church, and now someone had to be with her every time she got up to go outside. If she went anywhere away from the house, she would have to be taken on a sled or in a wagon. I don't believe any of us up here, except the chapel people, had outhouses. They were still going off to the woods or behind a bush, and sometimes just around the corner of the cabin to do their business. Grandpa and Papa must have thought up some way to make that easier for Grandma. It took a long time, but she finally got to where she sometimes could walk a little. I remember seeing her in the field beside her house a time or two picking strawberries. Aunt Flora and Jessie were still living at home, but they had to do a lot of the outside work and weren't always able to be close to help Grandma. Even though Aunt Weenie came several times a week to help out, everyone was glad when Aunt Jane came to live with Grandma. Jane McIntosh was an old lady who had no place of her own to stay. She was not really our aunt, but we usually called older people aunt or uncle out of respect. She received a meager pension from the government because of a son who had served in the army. She would always use part of her pension check to buy something to pay for staying at Grandma's. Back then, the old people were always taken care of. Usually they lived with their relatives, but if they didn't have anyone, someone would take them in and keep them. The older people would try to help out, and if they received a pension like Aunt Jane did, they would also help by paying or buying things for the family. The chapel women had always been so good to help when there was any kind of sickness, but they were working day and night helping those with typhoid. Several people had already died, and many more were very sick. Mrs. Elsie A. Robinson, one of the chapel women, was a trained nurse and truly an angel of mercy during the epidemic. She went from house to house caring for those with the fever. She gave out medicine and advised the families as much as she could about trying to prevent spreading the deadly disease. She was a great lady, not only concerned about the health of their bodies, but also their souls, especially those souls so close to meeting their Creator. It was that same year when Aunt Jane came down with a bad case of the measles. Aunt Flora, Aunt Weenie, and Mama tried everything to make her better, but they thought for sure that she was going to die. The measles are so much harder on an older person, and now with typhoid fever spreading around the community like it was, they were afraid that she might come down with that too. In the afternoon, Mama and Aunt Weenie had their own homes and chores to tend to. So every day after rest time, Mama would tell Beatrice and me to run down to Grandma's and take care of Aunt Jane. And Grandma kept us busy running for the rest of the afternoon. We would get water from the spring several times to take to Aunt Jane. Grandma said it was very important for her to drink plenty of water. We would wipe Aunt Jane's face and arms to help cool her off, and sometimes Grandma would instruct us to sit there and watch her. Maggie and the needle. It was customary to have a rest time after the noon meal. The adults who had been working hard in the fields all morning would find a place to lay down while the children played quietly outside. Maggie usually worked inside or around the cabin helping Mama. She did not like to work outside, but sometimes there was so much work to get done in the fields that she simply had to. One morning, Mama had been sewing, making a towel out of a flour sack. She laid her sewing down to fix dinner to have it on the table by noon. After dinner, everyone lay down in their favorite places. Papa napped on the floor with his head propped up in the doorway. Grandpa took a chair outside and turned it upside down and leaned up against it. Aunt Flora always laid on the bench on the front porch. During rest time, Burl and I would scoot out to go pick apples or go down by the creek to play. Maggie, who was not as active as we were, liked to stay in the house. On this particular day, Maggie decided to do some sewing. She had learned how to sew quite well for an 11-year-old, but Mama wouldn't let her use the needle without asking. She only had one needle, and she was afraid that Maggie would lose it. Rest time was about over when Mama sat down to continue her sewing. She picked up the towel she was making, but couldn't find her needle anywhere. She looked everywhere, and the more she looked, the more upset she became. Maggie didn't say a word. About that time, Mama heard the hens cackling and went outside to gather the eggs. While she was out, Maggie put the needle back. When Mama came in, there that needle was, right there in her sewing, just as she had left it. Mama looked at that needle and then looked at Maggie. By the look on her face, we all knew she was mad. I laughed and said, "It was there all the time, wasn't it? You just couldn't find that needle." I knew Maggie had used it, but I was just trying to cover up for her, you know. I thought maybe if I joked with Mama, she wouldn't be so mad. I hadn't said much more than that when Papa came up off that floor and wore me out. Papa had never whipped me before. He would always tell Mama if he thought we needed a spanking, and she would take care of it. I believe he was probably afraid that if he ever got mad enough to whip one of us, that because of his strength and size, he might harm us. Oh, he would take off his old felt hat every once in a while and give us a good whack across the backside, or pull a switch off the tree and give us a few sting marks when we were doing wrong. Even that would scare us half to death. It happened so rarely, though. In my child's mind, my intentions were pure, and I couldn't see a thing wrong with what I had said. I'd been covering up for Maggie, not laughing and making fun of Mama. I thought he was terrible to me for whipping me like that. Of course, looking back, I guess that was mean of me, laughing at Mama and saying that the needle had been there all along. We knew better than to say anything hateful to Mama, but I really didn't think I was being hateful. I thought I was being funny. I certainly never did forget that lesson. Remedies, doctors. When Beatrice and I got down to Grandma's that same afternoon, Grandma thought I was coming down with the measles because my eyes were red and tired looking. Well, they were tired all right, tired of crying. I told Grandma I was fine, but she seemed worried because I didn't appear to be my usual self, full of endless chatter and questions. Everyone thought for sure Beatrice and I would take the measles next, but it was actually Maggie and Burl who were working out in the field and coming in hot and tired every day who got them first. Beatrice and I ended up catching the measles from them. Poor Aunt Jane was apparently not getting any better. Then one day, this old man told my daddy, "Go, Laura, you need to go hunt for some sheep manure and use it to make her some tea. That'll fix her right away." Well, you can be sure Aunt Jane did not want to take that kind of medicine, but Grandma told him to go get it anyway. Grandma made the sheep manure tea, but Aunt Jane kept her mouth shut tight. They persisted, trying to talk her into taking it, and finally she drank not more than a mouthful. Sure enough, she was better in a day or two. We sure did have some unusual treatments and cures back in those days. One common ailment was what we called thrash. It was a breaking out, usually in a baby's mouth. Their mouths would get so sore they couldn't eat, and sometimes the babies would even die. Mama said that when I was a baby, she took me to a funeral up here at the fish place. I was crying and making a big fuss when this old woman asked her, "What's wrong with that young'un of yourn? She's got her mouth sore. Thrash, I reckon. Give her to me." The lady took me down to the barn and rubbed my mouth with cow manure. By the next morning, the sores dried up, and Mama said I never again had thrash, though they used to tease me about having cow manure in my mouth. I told them, "I don't care what you say, I'm here, and I reckon my mouth is a-working just fine." We did have some mighty strange remedies compared to what's available today. It sounds awful, but it was believed that these cows, sheep, and other animals ate all kinds of herbs, and when the herbs had been digested, they turned into a medicinal form. I don't know how they came up with those ideas. There were also superstitions about what caused and cured diseases. For example, if you wanted to cure a baby's thrush, you would have to find a man who had never seen his papa. When that man blew into the child's mouth, the thrush would be cured. I never did understand that one, though Mama had some strange practices herself. She'd rub our mouths with a salted meat skin and then give the meat to a dog to eat. The meat skin couldn't touch the floor or ground or anything before the dog ate it. The salted meat would cure the thrush and the dog would eat the germs. Salty meat was a common cure. Bulls were common when we were little, and I still have scars from them on my neck. Mama tied salty meat to our bulls as a poultice. So many of our ailments were caused from bad diets. Of course, the chapel women recognized this and spent a lot of time trying to teach the women about proper nutrition. But many of the people were slow to accept change, if not even downright resentful of the outsiders who would suggest the need for it. Mountain people had funny ideas, superstitions, and prejudices about doctors, foreigners, anyone from outside the community, and colored people. This was especially true of the old people. They were the most set in their ways, and there was nothing you could do about it. There was no reasoning, no need to argue or discuss anything with them. A lot of mountain people never saw a colored person until they were nearly grown. When they did see one, I don't think that they felt colored people weren't as good as white people. Most of the people were just afraid because they had never seen someone with the skin of a different color before. Prejudice is really just fear based on ignorance. That's all it is. Others, like Grandma Corn, were more accepting of all people and considered colored people just another variety of human beings that God had created. They were no different than white or red or whatever other colors might be out there beyond these mountains. My grandma even had a colored doctor, Dr. Branch, who came to see her when she broke her hip. My mama, on the other hand, would never have let a colored doctor touch her. She probably got those ideas from her people, as strange as they were, but then again, we rarely saw any colored people up in these parts. My first experience with a colored person was when I ran into Grandma's doctor. I was by myself running down through the field on my way to Grandma's. About halfway through the field, I came upon the path where I saw fresh shoe prints. I thought maybe Papa had come in from the field to go check on Grandma, so I started following them, trying to put my foot in each of the shoe prints. Now, of course, I had to work at stretching my short legs out to step where Papa had stepped. I was concentrating real hard at that, trying to keep my balance just about the time I got to the footlog. I ran right into Dr. Branch. I didn't know who he was or why he was black. All I knew was that I had never heard tell of any black people, and it scared the wits right out of me. I didn't know whether I should run back home or run the other way. Over time, I realized my folly. Dr. Branch was a very nice man who truly cared a great deal about his patients. His office was in Newport, and when he came up here to visit Grandma and his other patients, he would ride the train to West Myers. From there, he would walk the 3 miles up and over the mountain through Morgan Gap, go past Ebenezer Mission, and on down the road to Grandma's place. Can you believe that he would check on her and give her medicine for only $2, and then he had to walk all that way back? If anyone had need of a doctor for an emergency, someone would have to walk into town to get him. Usually the doctor would come right back with them. Isn't it something how that man was willing to do all that walking to take care of a patient and charge only $2? Nowadays, you have to travel to the doctor's office and wait sometimes hours on him, and he charges you $50 for just the privilege of seeing him. But not Dr. Branch. He made all the effort in the world for his patients. Times have changed, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. We'll stop right there, the really interesting part. And that term, colored people, today we say people of color. A lot of people might say that, or just you know, black is the word that's used, but that was just a different time. So in Opal's mind, she wasn't meaning anything by saying that, colored people, and then now it is today, you hear people say people of color. Anyway, so I hope no one was offended by that. They shouldn't have been, because that's just truly what the term that was common in those days. So really interesting insight, though, from Opal to talk about that. And she's explaining it, like she says about the prejudice, it's a fear. People was afraid, unfounded, no reason to be, just folly. She says she found out her own folly when she thought, you know, later could look back and think about how Dr. Branch really helped not just her grandma, but so many other people. But it was just that she had never seen a person like that, the way they looked, you know, never seen that. So it's hard for us to imagine today, because we travel and we, you know, people are, there's more population and more people settled of different nationalities and different races and all that. So it'd be like, really? Did she never see a black person? But she didn't. It reminds me of when, if you've done any studying about the Native Americans, a lot of them, how shocked they were when they saw some of the first settlers, especially the ones that were so white, and then that had maybe blonde hair and the blue eyes. They even thought that something was wrong with their eyes because of how translucent blue they were. I tease about little Woodrow. He's so fair-skinned. He's translucent when he's out in the sunshine. You can see through his skin. You see his little veins and stuff. He's just so fair-skinned. So really interesting, though. But I like Opal's wisdom. And again, another thing for us just to love Grandma Corn. She was the wisest person, wasn't she? And you can see why Opal really looked up to her. So she didn't buy into none of that foolishness, and she knew that all men are created equal in the image of God. All men created in the image of God, which is really marvelous to think about if you're a believer. Anyway, I like that part a lot. I like the part about her. I don't like that she broke her hip, but that's really fascinating to think about that. So you think, did they not? Of course, in those days, today we hear about people that fall and break their hip, and a lot of times they have to have surgery and they have pins or something, and then it's a long process, but they get over it. Sometimes today our hip joints are just wore out, and somebody has to have surgery to redo them, and then again, it's a long process, but they get over it. So none of those things were available to her. So it makes you wonder if she didn't, like when she broke it, if it just didn't heal back right. Maybe it was off kilter or whatever, and that's why it gave her such a fit for the rest of her life. It is amazing, though, that she gradually got to where she could walk a little bit, and Opal has those memories of seeing her out in the strawberry patch. That's really amazing when you think about somebody dealing with a broke hip. The very first story she's sharing, that was been a story that her grandma told her that had been passed down through their family. It's really interesting and really, you know, a nice story about him trying to get the apples to feed the soldiers, and then her coming with the gun, and then they end up married. You know, really a sweet story there of John Peter and of Hannah. Interesting that little footnote is to me, because I've never heard of a place in Clayton and in that area, even though I'm familiar with their Towns County. It's talking about Clayton is in Rabun County, but in that general area between the two. The footnote is like Hiawassee or Hiawassee. It's got a V in there. I think maybe that's just a typo, and maybe it's just Hiawassee, which is, you know, just right up the road from me. I did Google, like, trying to find, like, Hiawassee, using that spell in Georgia, and what come up was Hiawassee. So I thought, well, there's me a sign that maybe that was it. So that part was real interesting. And interesting from someone like me that loves to think about the culture and the heritage passed down from each generation. Fascinating to hear those dates, and then realize that as those generations just continued all the way to Opal, and then Opal's children, all those just in that same kind of general area of thinking about, that would be north Georgia, but then, you know, East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, in that same little general area, how those generations of families just remained in that same area. And in doing that, that means their cultures and their heritage, whether it is culture, like traditions, even all those remedies and things like that, and certainly the way we speak, how they're just passed down in that really localized area. So I found that really, really fascinating. She says that Aunt Jane, that was the one that had the measles, you've probably heard this too, I have, that in old days they thought if you had the measles, which was much more common than today, of course, because people are vaccinated for measles, but that once they broke out, you were okay. And I've heard just countless stories of that sheep manure tea, sheep dip tea, that it was used to break out the measles. Once you took that, drank the tea, then the measles would break out all over your body. Then you could begin to get better. So that part was really interesting. But also that they called Aunt Jane, even though she wasn't really the aunt. Pap told me that when he was a boy, that tradition continued, so that they called, maybe it was a neighbor man, but it wasn't really related, and they'd call him Uncle, Uncle Clayt or whatever, even though he wasn't really related. It was just a term of respect, which is really sweet when you think about it, calling them aunt or uncle. And then thinking about Aunt Jane being sick, what a different time. The mother, Opal's mother, would go down there and help when she could, but of course she had her own family to take care of. It was hard for her to go. But she would send Opal and Beatrice, and even at that young age, they could get the water, they could wipe her down with a towel, helping with thinking about a fever. In those days, you just had to kind of keep people cool. I'm about to get a fever today sitting by the wood stove. I'm getting a little warm. But what a different time. And she sent them just to help, because she couldn't go, so she'd send them, even though they were so very young, and just let them do what Grandma told them to do, and they did, and they helped. So that's really, really amazing. The other remedy they talk about is the thrash. Thrash, that's thrush. Most people would say thrush. You hear people in that's our accent, say thrash. The baby's got the thrash. And that one is still alive today in my area of Appalachia. Not the cow manure one, not that, but some people having the ability to blow in the baby's mouth and cure the thrash. I have a video about that talks much more detail about it. I'll link to it in the description below if you're interested in that. And that being able to blow in their mouths like that goes right along. It's like faith healing. I have another video about how you can blow the fire out of a burn. Some people can take the burn out of a fire. Some people blow on it. Some people repeat a Bible verse, stop the bleeding. There's all different ones like that. And those things are less and less as time goes by. I certainly probably heard people talk about them more in my childhood than like Corey and Katie have in their childhood, in my children's. And then maybe Woodrow and Ira won't hear anybody talk about it. Maybe they'll hear me talk about it though, but maybe nobody else. So really, really interesting to think about all those old remedies. I hope you enjoyed this part today. I hope, as always, you'll leave your thoughts and in the comments below. And I hope you'll drop back by next Friday so we can see what Opal does next, what happens to her in her life next.